Well, this is a great gospel story this morning in Numbers chapter 25. A little bit of the story. Children of Israel were playing around with people that hated God. And those people begged them, said, why don't you worship our God? And so they bowed down to those false gods. And this brought God's anger, his intense anger. He said, behead them. So they did. You read the rest of the story, Rick read it, 24 some thousand lost their heads over this. And picture this. 24,000 people dead. 24,000 heads hung up in the sun. And in walks Zimri. Just as cocky as he can be, just as smart aleck as he can be, just as against the gospel as he can be, with his two-bit woman. I thought it was interesting. Her name is Cosby. No one will laugh about that one. And Phinehas sees this. He's the son of Eleazar, long line of priests. And he gets enraged. I mean, he's so enraged, he's got to do something. And so he kills both of them. God says, my wrath is turned. Someone zealous did it. This picture of Christ. And consequently, there's a covenant of peace. And that's going to be for his seed forever. And therein is the atonement. Well, if you think Christ isn't mad over sin, you're wrong. Revelation says that the day of the wrath of the Lamb, and indeed, furious he was. So now we begin looking at your outline. God's wrath was stayed because death was brought to death. Those 24,000, and Zimri and his woman, Midianitess woman, were brought to death, and death consequently was brought to death. You read in here, and it says, kill all those that join themselves under Baal Peor, or Baal, if you want to pronounce it that way, to this false god. Kill them all. And it's a picture of God's hating sin and bringing sin to death. Then along comes this zealous one, and he's intensely provoked. And he's provoked about God's wrath and no one doing anything about it. And that's something to think about. And he's provoked about sin and no one doing anything about it. Boy, we live in a country like that. But because this one was so full of zealous jealousy for God and for his way and for his word, that he came and killed those two particularly, that God says the covenant of peace comes through him. You read it properly. He says the covenant of peace is going to come through this one who kills death. That's Christ. Consequently, God's wrath is turned away from his people. Now, there were 24,000 or so that weren't his people. His wrath was brought down upon them, but the rest of the children of Israel, God's wrath was turned from them. And there's a picture that God's wrath is turned away from all his people because death is brought to death. The covenant of peace brought in an attitude of being provoked over sin. Study that in the rest of the scriptures. When God's people would see this heinous sin, they'd get provoked over it. Paul stood face to face, eventually brought to death because of his stand, and others also. But the covenant of peace brings to God's people a hate of sin. But this covenant of peace also brings to God's people atonement for it. They're paid for. All of their sin paid for by Christ. He says it in Colossians 2 and verse 10 and so many other places in Hebrews. It's all paid for by Christ, and consequently, God has received us and accepted us in and because of and by the beloved, because he brought to death that which we deserved, that we might live forever with him. Thus, the everlasting covenant of grace is ushered in, and indeed it is. When God talks about this being an everlasting covenant, and he does, he means for his people, for those for whom the death was brought to death. For those people is an eternity of the covenant of peace in their life. They shall reign with their Lord forever and forever. And so we see the gospel of God's covenant of grace is made plain in this story. But I want to draw some conclusions for us to think about today. Number one, I want you to think about this. Not only sin must be abhorred, but sin will be by God's people who have been brought to see how much sin irritates God. Secondly, the only way that sin can be brought to an end satisfactory to God is by the death of his Son. Nothing less will satisfy God. Nothing less will set the sinner free. Nothing less will pay the price of sin. And so in that, we see the covenant of peace established. You see, we step back in our minds and we see all the children of Israel. And we see 24,000 some heads on posts out here of people that disobeyed God and infuriated holy God. And to those people, they're aware of one thing. They didn't die. They can't die. God satisfied for them. It is an eternal covenant of peace. It's established in the hearts of his people. And I say that this is indeed everlasting. That'll help you. Give it some thought.